Thank you for coming. My name is Donna Thompson, and I have been, as Terry said, I've been in NEARA just about like 18 years now. And I am going to talk to you today about the antiquarian movement. Um, does anybody know what an antiquarian is? Has anybody ever thought about that? So our acronym is NEARA. We're New England Antiquities Research Association. How many of you actually knew what NEARA stood for? All right, raise your hand. You can lie to me. That's fine. It took me a few years to know what it was. I would say it and I'm going to get it wrong and I get it right. But Antiquities is in our name. It doesn't say New England Historical Research Association or Archaeological Research. It's an Antiquities Association. And we know what we do. We look at stone structures like these. So we go out in the woods and we look at stone structures and then we study them and we document them. And if you're good, like some people have been in the past, you take the time to write up a report and put it in the site DB or file it with your chapter coordinator. And if you're even better, you start to add your information into our NEARA journal. And this here is a word cloud of all the journal topics that we have covered since the journal, I think it was 1966 to 2008. So the larger the heading, the more times the word was focused in a topic of a journal article. Let you take a look at that. I'm sure you all see something that you find interesting in there. Okay, but again, we are an antiquarian society. That makes you an antiquarian. You are not a historian if you're here, and you're not an archaeologist, but you may be those two as well if you're in this and you also have other pursuits. But let's look at the difference between what an antiquarian, an archaeologist, and a historian is. I know it's early. Thank you, Sydney, for getting all the coffee. Hopefully everybody's gotten some. But again, we are antiquarians. Okay. So this is the word history in Greek. It's all Greek to me. I mean, it looks very difficult. So history comes from the word for the stories of the past. It specifically applies to stories that are written down, so written stories. So as makes sense, right? Historians study the written word, and they only study the written word. There might be some shortcomings to being a historian if you're only focusing on studying the written word. Can anybody think of anything that might be problematic? Art. Art, yes. Oral history, right. Anything else? What about pre-literate societies? Yeah, if you don't have a written language, then you can't study them. And also, I'd like you to think about who's doing the writing too. Was everybody literate? No. So the only stories that are going to remain in writing are the people who were literate, and we're leaving out a good portion of the written word, and then so we're losing a lot of the history that we're trying to study. Okay. Archaeology comes from the Greek word for ancient legends or ancient history. Makes sense? You've heard a legend about the past and you think you might find evidence for it. So what do? You dig it up, right? So again, we know what archaeologists do. They look for things under the ground, but there's some shortcomings with that too. Any ideas about what might be problematic if you're only studying things that are under the ground? What was that?
Mr. Lennox has a saying.
Dig into the records before you dig in the ground.
Absolutely. Dig into the records before you dig in. And archaeologists do a lot of research, you're right. But their main focus is finding things under the ground. But you're only going to find whatever's left behind after a long time. Things just deteriorate. They're gone. You're not going to find them. So we're only finding the things that have remained. So antiquarian comes from the word antiquities. It's word for people of the past. So and antiquarians study people in the past. So what exactly is an antiquarian? An antiquarian studies history with particular attention to ancient artifacts, archaeological and historical sites, or historic archives and manuscripts. And again, archaeologists do that as well, but antiquarians are free to study it all. They're not limited by some of the strictures that other areas of study are. So there are three things that really, this is my hypothesis about what antiquarians do. They usually focus on a very specific area of study. They typically concentrate on a geographic area. And sometimes this is maybe a shortcoming. Antiquarians may let a personal hypothesis guide their research. Anyone who heard Terry last night can attest to the fact that that might happen. And that's something we are actually going to talk about today too. So for us as NEARA members, antiquarians focus on a specific area of study. We know what that looks like. Again, that's this. Antiquarians typically concentrate on a geographic region. For us, it's Northeast North America. Can anybody see any benefits to why focusing on a specific region will be good?
To be more local.
Yeah, you get more, you're local, you might know the people around you. You really get to know the history. Maybe you grew up in a region. So that's very helpful. And then antiquarians often let a personal hypothesis guide their research. In our research, we generally have one question that comes up all the time. Anybody have any thoughts about what that might be? Who made these, right? Yeah, and a lot of hypotheses have come out of NEARA's research over the last 60 years. And go ahead. These are some of them. How many of you were aware that these are things that NEARA has studied in the last 60 years? Yeah, this is our basis. Yeah. How many of you thought it was only, I'm sorry, what's the pointer? This one. Yeah, some people thought that. No, this is not the case. This is an antiquarian society that's studied a lot of things. All of these things have come out of NEARA. So it's important for us to understand our roots and where we came from. And, we're not going to pass judgment on people today. We're not going to say good or bad, but it's really important to understand how people's thinking led them to where they are. So early antiquarians focused, there were antiquarians all over the world and generally focused in the areas of study. So you could find Chinese antiquarians, you could find any Asian, Japanese, African antiquarians, European antiquarians, but for our purpose, because most of the ideas that we focus on are from Europe, we're going to look at those. The Renaissance antiquarians, beginning with Petrarch in the 14th century, really started to concentrate on Roman ruins and inscriptions. So the first things they were looking for was the big remains of past societies. And of course, if you're an early antiquarian, Rome is everywhere. And a lot of people didn't know what it was, so they really decided to start to study that. And Petrarch was really the first person to start to do that. Well, he's not an antiquarian. This is Sir Francis Bacon, and he was the first person who really championed the idea that scientific knowledge could emerge from inductive reasoning and careful observation about the world. He famously stated, when industrious persons, by an exact and scrupulous diligence and observation, out of monuments, names, words, proverbs, and traditions, private records, and evidence, fragments of stories, passages of books that concern not story and the like, do save and recover somewhere from the deluge of time. So he's really pushing for people to learn from what's around them. And again, this is one of the quotes that he's famous for too. Antiquities are history defaced. And if you think about history defaced, we interpret what we find through what we know or what's left of what we find. So we really don't know for sure what we have, but these are what have casually survived the shipwreck of time. Okay, again, in France, again, we're focusing in Europe. They really started to focus on the monuments when they started to do antiquity studies. Jacob Spon, he was one of the first people to start to categorize antiquities, and he really thought that there were certain areas of study that you should focus on. And from this picture of him and his work, you can see what he thought was important. You see he has statues, there's relics of buildings. He also thought that coins, epigraphy, paintings, carved gems, bas-reliefs, manuscripts, and then there were 8 categories. It's the comprehensive category that included military items, domestic utensils, nautical items, vases, weights, and measures. But he left out a large portion of what could be studied. And you can see this guy here. If you can't see what he's doing? Yeah, he's rubbing that. I don't know if he's taking a rubbing, but he's definitely looking at the inscription there. So this is what an early antiquarian thought was really worthy of study. So this one is from Ole Worm. I'm sorry, I was thinking his other name. He was Danish, and he was one of the first people who started to study runes. And at the time, there was an intense competition among the Nordic countries to try to be the first one to interpret runes. Can you imagine why?
There's so many monuments with runes on them.
There were a lot, yep. And anybody else?
Tells history, maybe.
Well, it tells history. Okay, so this was a national race. So every country's like trying to race to be the first one to interpret all these runes, so we could say, no, we know it. And you know what? We were the first ones to invent the runes, not you over there in Sweden. Norway did it, not you. And then the second reason is they wanted to prove that these runes actually predated Latin. They wanted to say, you know what? We are actually better than the Romans. We have this, and we are good. And a lot of the antiquarian studies did that. It was based on an idea that they were trying to foster. And you did see this here. So his inscription, if you didn't see it, those are what he thought was runes. And he did actually interpret runes eventually, but this one is a natural formation in a rock. It's actually not runes. So we do have to give him credit for what he did, but also realize that he had some shortcomings as well. Okay, love the hair. This is John Aubrey. How many of you know Aubrey? Aubrey Holes, anybody? Yeah, exactly, yes. So he was born in Wiltshire, England in 1626, so early 1600s, and he came of age in a time when England was, well, we'll say, kind of falling apart. There were chronic warfare, changes of sovereigns all the time, all kinds of issues going on. And he grew up pretty much in the shadow of Stonehenge and all these ruined monuments. And when he looked around, he would always ask his family, like, what happened here? What was here? He wanted to know because he just saw these ruins. And also, he famously notes that when he would be out and about, he'd see like people would cover their books with the remains of the manuscripts that had come from the monasteries. Imagine those beautiful hand-covered monuments, all like just for a book cover, sometimes wrapping fish. Yeah, so he became like passionate about the past. He really wanted to save it. He was well educated for his time, but he was not rich. And, you know, he is obviously a gentleman. You can see that from his dress. He wasn't a peasant. But if you're a rich man at the time, you want to go to Europe and you want to study the antiquarian things. You want to go look at those Roman ruins and you have the grand tour. He did not get to do that. And good thing for us that he didn't.
I'm sorry, Donna, when was he?
In the 1600s. So he was born in 1626. So he died in the late 1600s. And, oops, sorry. Wrong one. So this obviously is Stonehenge. And he famously drew this, and he did a lot of other drawings as well. And he focused his attention on the local ruins, again, starting with Stonehenge and sites like that. This particular drawing dates to 1666. After he did a lot of his antiquarian studies, He was even able to convince Charles II, the King of England at the time, to protect Avebury. We think that, we're the only ones with problems. Back then, they were taking the stones from Avebury. How many of you have been there? If you get there, go. It's amazing. They were taking the stones and using them for their foundations, and he was able to convince them to protect it. And also, the collections that he made, he collected everything. All those manuscripts, he's like, don't put the fish in it, give it to me, I'm going to save it. And he collected all of that. And his collection was the foundation of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Anybody been to the Ashmolean? Pretty cool if you get there too. So, he was very passionate, but he definitely was a man of his times. And again, this is when I got to go there. He was one of the first people to actually attribute this to people who were from England. People thought that this is a Roman ruin. They really didn't know, but he said, no, this is our stuff. We did this. This makes him, in my opinion, one of the key early antiquarians, because he really, he looked locally. He focused really locally on his things, and he was very passionate about that. And he also did things that other people don't do. Like if it was not in writing, it was considered, no, it's not important. As antiquarians, we know everything's not in writing. You have to document it. And even if he couldn't find the proof, he documented. So, again, we're very grateful for what he did and his foundation for that. And again, but despite his many contributions, he did have a mindset of that era. He was really focused on two things. The first is proving that things in Europe were just as important. I mean, things in England were just as important as things in Europe. He didn't get to go on that grand tour, but he wanted people to know that these were important too. And of course, it's going to come back by the time I get to the end. Okay, so now we're going to go over across the sea, and we're going to go to New England because we are in New England. This is a map done by excuse me, John Smith. I think it was 1608. And you can see the ships here, the big ones. Oops, wait a minute. Notice they're the focus of this drawing as well. If we want to be real about it, we should add more. They're going over here. It's more like an invasion. Yeah. So we're gonna look at the people who first came to New England. We had the Pilgrims, and we also had the Puritans. So tonight we're going to the Puritan back room, which is kind of unusual. Has anybody ever been there? No, it's pretty good. You're gonna like it. Okay. So Puritans were a unique bunch of people if you really didn't know them. And I'm going to put this up here for you. This is not really the 10 Commandments, but this is called the Puritan 10 Commandments. If you want to take a look at what they thought. I mean, of course, they believed in the 10 Commandments, but they were a very strict bunch of people. Despite their strict moral code, there were so many things you couldn't do. They did have things that you could do. If you grew up in New England, you've heard about the Puritan work ethic, otherwise known as if you can't find something to do, I'll find you something to do. Your parents would tell you that. You learn never to say, I don't have anything to do, I'm bored. But they were very focused on work and morality and making sure that you could follow their rules and stay ahead of the church.
Christmas was out.
Yeah, despite their strict moral code, Puritans didn't believe in leisure. They did believe in some leisure time activities. You could enjoy yourself. You could go out and have some drinks with your friends, but you couldn't go to excess. You couldn't celebrate holidays. You could not have Thanksgiving. You couldn't have Christmas. Theaters definitely out. Plays, no way. And actually, believe it or not, sports, they frowned on sports. Sounds like a wholesome activity, but they were afraid that people were actually going to bet on the sporting outcome. So they said, no, no sports. Okay, so what was left? Music, but only if it was associated with the church. Art and dancing, were permitted, but only in conjunction with the church or the state. And you could study history and you could study the natural sciences. So you could sing in your meeting house. This is the interior of the old ship church. This is in Hingham, Mass. If you haven't been in there, this is the oldest existing meeting house in New England. At the time, it had no electricity, no heat. Can you imagine, breaking out into song in there? It wouldn't be too inspiring. So I think it was 1640. It's still, if you want to go there, it's pretty cool. It's on the National Register too. So you could do art, and again, art for art's sake. This guy's last name is Anguish. So yeah, this is a Puritan. So this is the kind of art that they encouraged. And then you could do funerary art. So you could carve yourself a gravestone. There were really not a lot of activities that were encouraged by Puritans. But again, they did allow what they called the sober arts. They turned to reading, and reading, writing, history, and natural history are the big things. You can see here, it says, "My book and heart shall never part." This is from an early reader that the Puritan students would use. And this is a Puritan with a book. And believe me, I looked really hard to find one. This one was done in 1888 because Puritans didn't really believe in focusing on leisure activity. It's hard to find an image of someone that was contemporary doing leisure activity. So, and the title of this one is called Puritan, a book. These people were extremely literate. So if you think of London, England, they estimate by the amount of people who could sign their name that about 30% of the population was literate. If you come over to New England at the time, they say that about 30% of male population in London was literate. 60% of New Englanders at the time were literate, which is extremely high, and that's male and female. And most homes owned at least one book. Imagine what book that would be. The Bible, but they did, and they practiced, and they were very, very good at that. So and again, what they called these topics that we covered here, that you're allowed to do, they were called the sober arts. So something that didn't get you too excited. So yeah, can you imagine carving that gravestone is not very exciting. But one of their pursuits that was allowed was history and natural sciences. So if you think about it, why did this matter? These people were, again, very, very literate. It wasn't a cultural backwater. There was information going back and forth across the ocean all the time. So if you think, oh, they didn't know anything, they knew what was going on in England. They had access to all the ideas and information from Europe, and they were very, very serious about their history. And so when you combine this passion with history, this passion with natural sciences and reading and writing, and the Puritan 10 Commandments, what do you think you get? You get the lost tribes of Israel. Yeah, that is one of the study areas that people in New England, NEARA actually didn't focus on, but early New Englanders did. But it does come forward into the Antiquarian movement. So what the heck is the lost tribe of Israel? So these are a bunch of people who actually looked into it. These are names that might be associated over here, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of them you do know, like John Eliot. And what does it mean? So indigenous people of North and South America are descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel, which were expelled around 720 BCE following the Assyrian conquest of Israel. Either that, or they were descended of people who were Turkic speaking that were descendants of the lost tribe of Israel. So the lost tribe of Israel ended up in Russian steppes, and the Indians were descendants of that. But how did this idea get here? Okay, so why do we even care about the 10 tribes of Israel? So at the time, the Jewish people had been expelled from England in 1210 by Edward I. And there was this Jew whose name was Manasseh ben Israel, and he had been living in Denmark, and he was trying to get them readmitted into England. He wanted to be able to have Jewish people come back to England. And he had heard a report from someone who had been a Jew who had converted to Christianity, who actually been in Ecuador, believe it or not, and come to Denmark, and he met him there. And he said that when he was down there, he met a bunch of people who actually were practicing Jewish rites, and he said that they were indigenous people of South America. And Ben Israel said, that's it. They're the lost tribes of Israel. He literally became convinced of the idea. And so he took this and he incorporated it into his book. And his book makes it across the ocean to Edward Winslow. Everybody knows who Edward Winslow is. And he reads it and says, you know what? If the lost tribes of Israel are in South America, they're definitely in New England. And that's what we have here. But it's important to focus on the fact that there really wasn't any cultural evidence of this. They were just looking at the history because they read all the history. They knew the history of the Bible. They knew the history of Europe. And they compared that with what they were finding. So they took the cultural traits that they assumed would be Jewish, and I'm sure that they didn't probably even know any people who were Jewish at the time, but they assumed that this was the lost tribes of Israel. And John Eliot, who was one of the first people in New England who settled the Indian praying villages, he bought into this too for a while. So why does this actually matter? There's no facts about it, really. You don't actually, it doesn't matter that the facts are there. They tried to bend it to make it into what they want it to be. So they thought that the end times were coming. We all know what the end times are? Yeah, so the world is going to end, and Jesus is going to come back and bring the people up to heaven. So at the time, the Puritans believed that Gentiles and Jews would start to be converted right before the end times came. And so if a mass conversion would occur, and they were thinking of the conversion of the native people as part of the mass conversion. So if you can convert all these people from Judaism into Christianity, then you're gonna bring along the end times. So they really were excited for this. They wanted to go up to heaven and things like that. And one of the preachers at the time, his name is escaping my mind, said it was going to happen in the 1650s. So they were all excited for this. So looking for it, waiting for it to happen. 1650s go by, doesn't happen. 1660s go by, it doesn't happen. 70s go by, 80s, and by after the King Philip's War, it hadn't happened. They start to think, it's maybe not happen. But the idea still stays around. There's no cultural proof about it. There's no information about it, but it stays here. And this book here is a picture of Winslow's book at the time where he wrote about it. I don't need to read it to you. In the 1850s, you're going to see it here. This is from a lecture that was given at a university in the 1850s. We're still hearing about this idea. Again, no proof about it. You think the idea would go away because there's no proof? Okay, so now we're going to go out to the Ohio earthworks. In 1860, a man named David Wirk, and he was a supporter of the lost tribes of Israel idea. He was out doing some work in the Ohio earthworks, and he found this. Has anybody ever seen that? And it's called the Newark stone, and it has some Hebrew inscribed on the side. And there's a lot of controversy about how it was found, and we're really not going to get down that road. But, he found this information. He knew about the lost tribes of Israel, and this was found. He said it was found in the earthworks. If you want to read about that, you can. Okay, there were other things found too. That was found in June of the year. This one was found in December, and this one's called the Decalogue stone. And it was November 1860. And then again, somebody else, two other people, found this one, the Johnston Bradner stone, was found in 1867. And some recent research, again, I don't want to go into bad-mouthing people, but this came out, in 2014. This was published in 1853, and I'm going to enlarge that for you. And because we now can go into all these old archives and magazines, you can find all these kinds of things. It's very cool if you can't do it, but notice the similarity between these two. So it's possible it's a forgery, and again, we don't want to get down that road. But why is this idea so important, and why are people still following up about it? This is Bradley Lepper. He is an archaeologist who really worked on the Ohio earthworks, and he said this. He really thinks that in his research that the people who found these stones actually planted them, and he argues that by planting them, they were actually trying to do a cultural good. At the time, there was this hypothesis called polygenesis. That means that white people were one race, black people were another race, native people were a different race, and they were all different races. And Werrick and these people, they didn't believe that. They really truly believed that everybody was one race. And by burying these artifacts and digging them up, they're saying, hey, look, the native and the Israeli people, they're just like us, and they were here, and we're all one race. I mean, it's convoluted, but people use information in a way that makes sense for them. And again, this is an example of what antiquarians have done to forward their idea. And again, we're not going to pass judgment on that, but okay. So now we're going to move over to the Phoenicians in America. If you went over to America's Stonehenge, a lot of the people there think that some of the things are Phoenician. And again, I'm focusing on pre-1900. These are some of the people who came up with the ideas for it. And again, here's the ideas. So Phoenicians come across the ocean and they settle in America, or actually some people think that the Phoenicians came and then the Indians came and migrated over afterward. So where does this idea come from? Oh yes, and some of them, the Phoenicians came over and settled back. So Phoenicians are from the Mediterranean. Carthaginians, or sometimes they call it. And this, does everybody know what this is? Yeah, okay. So this is one of the bases of the whole hypothesis. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. It's it's the Dighton Rock. This is Dighton Rock, and this picture was drawn by Ezra Stiles at the time. He was president of Yale University, and he was fascinated by this thing, and he made copies of it, and he walked around with it a lot and asked a lot of people to do it, and he made it a lifelong focus. Okay, so this is what it looked like in 1893. And if you saw pictures of it last night that Peter showed in his presentation, it's currently surrounded. You can't get close to it like this. So the copy, this one here that Ezra Stiles made, ended up going over across the ocean again. And it ended up with this dude. His name was Antoine, and I apologize for my French, Court de Gebelin. And he received a copy of this from Stephen Sewell, who was a professor at Harvard. And Sewell really didn't believe in any theory. What he said is some believe it to be the work of Phoenicians who were driven here from Europe. Others think it's more hydrographical than literal, possibly created by navigators from China or Japan. I imagine it to be the work of indigenous people of North America. So that's what Sewell said when he sent it over to Court. But Court didn't hear that. All he heard was that one word, Phoenicians. So he writes this book here. And this copy of it is from the Massachusetts State Archives. Interesting a lot. So Court, he grew up as a Protestant, and he was in France. And if you can imagine being a Protestant in France during the 1700s, that wasn't really an admirable thing to do. And he was hyper-focused on spiritualism and the occult. He was fascinated by the tarot cards. And he believed that the ancient Egyptians had created tarot cards. And inside the tarot cards of the time were instructions. And if you knew how to read the instructions, you could interpret the past and predict the future using these cards, specifically about politics. So if you could read this, you know the politics of the future. So again, why does this matter? This book, you can see the notations on the side here. Do you want to take a guess who it belonged to? This is John Adams. John Adams had a copy of this. So John Adams knew him. He met with Benjamin Franklin. If you want to go, you can find Court's letters to Benjamin Adams in the records. So this man was definitely very influential. He was looking for a reason to have Phoenicians be in America. Can you imagine why would a rock in the middle of the Taunton River in Massachusetts matter to someone who's never been here? Why would he care that it's Phoenician? I know it's crazy, but he believed that, again, his occult readings, he felt like he could interpret the past, and if he could understand it, then he said that there used to be this great civilization all over the world, and including in North America, and that rock was the proof. And if that rock showed that there was a great civilization in America and it was rising again, and we were about to go through and going through our revolution, then there was hope for France. So this is pre-Revolutionary War France. So he's really truly taking this information and trying to weave it into a story that makes sense for him. Just something that we find all over the place. Okay, so again, the Phoenicians in America idea we don't have a lot of information on it. There's no evidence for it until we, and again, this is another lecture that was done basically saying, yeah, there's really no proof that Phoenicians were in America. But in the 1870s, they're still talking about it. So 100 years later, the idea is still out there. But really, this guy's saying, we don't have any proof. But now we've gone from Dighton River over to France, and now we're going to go to Brazil. So this is called the Paraiba Stone. In 1872, Dr. Ladislao Souza Neto, he was the director of the National Museum in Brazil. He received a copy. This is his transcription of the copy on the left here, of something that he was told that it was sent to him by a man whose last name was Costa. And he said that it was in Phoenician. And he was young, he was ambitious, and he wanted to prove himself. So he started to translate the stone. He didn't really know Phoenician, but he was willing to learn it, to figure it out. So he starts to translate it. And this is a later translation from someone else, but the stone. So at the same time, he starts looking around to say, all right, where is the stone? Paraiba's on a river in the northern part of the country. Brazil is as big as the United States. He's trying to find this guy Costa, trying to find the stone. He can't find either of them. All he has is this inscription, and everybody insists that it's real. So he says, fine, and he translates it, and he goes to the museum, and he's going to give a presentation for it. And at the time, Brazil was run by an emperor, Dom Pedro II, and he actually was in the audience when it was delivered. And Dom Pedro was very impressed by this, and he was very excited. Dom Pedro had just really come back from a biblical tour, and he had been in Asia, and he was a biblical scholar. So he's like, hey, this is great, Phoenician in Brazil. He was very excited. But if you go back to Neto, he eventually realized that someone had nobody knows for sure, and I'm not going to say that he did it, but he came to repudiate his translation. He said that it's not real. And if you look for it, the papers were all pulled down. But at the same time, you have this emperor who's really impressed by the Phoenician, very excited by the idea. And Neto, who had come up with it and done this talk, he silently repudiates it, doesn't really say anything. He can't come forward and say, hey, I was wrong, very loudly. And his career does go forward. But up until later in our century, there's really no information about Phoenicians in America. So I'm running out of time. Okay, we have Vikings, and I'm really not going to do that because we have Viking experts here. But these are some ideas about it. And you know all these. But I wanted to show you this. This is the official program from the dedication of the Pilgrim Monument, which is in 1902. And here it is there. And there's the inscription there. And if you start to read it, this is on the page there. They say things like, the Vikings were here. It's a done deal. This is the early 1900s, 1907. We had no proof at the time, but the thinking was so ingrained that it was automatic proof. So other people who were supposedly here at the time, a lot of these ideas came out of the Columbian expedition, and I don't have time to go into them. Was the Spanish, the Portuguese, Saint Brendan the Navigator, the Scots, yeah, lots of people were here before us, and a lot of that came out of the Columbian expedition idea. And then we have the Druids. So this one was the hardest, and if you hear a lot of NEARA people looking for Ogham writing, and I went a deep dive into the archives, and I really couldn't find anything. It's kind of shocking how little there was. I expected to be there a ton of information, but there wasn't until we get to this one. These two people, Joseph Peace Hazard and James Arnold. Here's the ideas. And this is Joseph Peace Hazard. So he lived in Rhode Island in the late 1800s, and his family owned a manufacturing company. And he was put to work at the manufacturing company, and he did so poorly, they basically fired him and said, go play in Europe, go away. So he did the grand tour of Europe, and he went to France and saw the monuments, and he went to England, and he fell in love with all the Druid ruins. And he started to do seances, again, he dabbled in the occult. He went to church in I can't remember the name of church, but he was really into the occult. And he came home and he built, his house here, which is Druid's Dream. So, I'm sorry. And this is currently on the National Register, and you can go see it. And across the street from that, he built this monument, and it's a Druid circle, and in the middle of it is a monument with an inscription on it. But if you go looking for it right now, this is what it looks like. There's really nothing left. And if you look at in the records, it basically say, oh, it's a Druid circle. Look at, or a witch's circle is another reason for it. And people are convinced that it was built by Druids. This is in Rhode Island, yeah. And again, it's across the street from his house, Druid Dreams, which is on the National Register. It's not hiding. If you look online, you can find it. On his diary. So if people want to know, this is the writing where he basically says on the side there, I built this. So there's no way to refute that it was done by Druids.
What happened to the stone, the monument?
I don't know. They don't know. Okay. And then we come to this other guy, James Arnold, who was in Rhode Island, and he wrote for the Narragansett Register, and he was actually an editor. And he comes up with the same idea that Druids were in America, and he immediately followed Peace Hazard. And he took these things here. You can see a rocking stone here on the bottom, and these are quarries in soapstone that are in Rhode Island. And he said that these are Druid remains, definitely Druid remains. And he wrote all kinds of articles, and he gave speeches about this. So it became like it was a done deal that Druids were in New England. And now if you look at it, people say, oh yeah, they've always been here. It's been in the record. But if anybody has any more information on it, I'd love to hear about it. Okay, so, and again, we're going back to the idea, and we do have to wrap up. Antiquarians often let a personal hypothesis guide their research. And we can see that for the people we talked about today. You know, others may have done the same thing. It doesn't mean that their research wasn't important. It's just the conclusions that they drew may not have been something that we would draw now. It's important that they have the records that they do, and they did the research that they did. But times change, people's ideas change, and we really need to remember that. When I started this work, I really looked for someone to do a history of the antiquarian movement. I went to the American Antiquarian Society, which is in Worcester. They don't have anybody. I was like, all right, well, how do I do this? I went to every university in New England asking, they don't have anybody. If anybody wants a PhD, There's a wide open topic area for you to take on right here. So there are some books, but we need historic study on this area, and I could do another one. But if we go down here, antiquarians, they're really volunteers. If you think of the early people who did it, they weren't paid for what they did, and they were passionate about what they did, and they had a lifelong study of the region of that they did. Whereas, archaeologists and historians, sometimes, mostly they're professionals. They've had professional training, and they learn through professional courses, and their pursuit is professional, and they may or may not be guided by the strictures that are required by their profession. So is there a value to being an antiquarian? Absolutely. I don't want people to come away from this thinking there's not. There definitely is. It's important that we do this work, important that we keep up with it, but we do need to keep in mind the ideas at our foundation, and don't make any assumptions when you go and read the records. Make sure that you're looking back, reading, why did they say this, like Terry said the other day. It's very important to do that. And again, thank you so much.
10 o'clock, but I think you could take a couple of questions.
How did we get into the Barry Fell era?
So I didn't go past 1900 because I really didn't want to go down that road. So Barry Fell used the same sources that we all have. But if you keep in mind that we have so much more information than anybody at the time did, you can go into your computer and pull up the archives like that John Adams. I just found that online. You can find these things. It's pretty fascinating. But he used the information that we had, and he did it. Anybody else?
Thank you.
All right, thank you.